Good afternoon, everyone, and welcome to the TOPCORP sponsored webinar for today, May 5th. Welcome and thank you for participating. Thank you for going through the registration process and being with us today. Tom Murphy is our speaker today. Tom is the director of the Penn State Marcellus Center for Outreach and Research and has been associated and was instrumental in the formation of the center since 2010. So he's got a long tenure in that area and has a lot of experience in Pennsylvania, was there at the forefront of our shale development in Pennsylvania, nationally and internationally, and is a friend and a colleague who has traveled the world literally helping other countries understand the Pennsylvania experience, but also providing some insight and experiences, and we're fortunate to have him today because he brings some of those back to him, and they're always integrated into the presentations that he makes for us today. So Tom, we're glad to have you, and thank you for taking the time to be with us today. Many of you, as we get started, many of you have been around the Zoom platform. You know about the chat pod, you know Q&A. We'd love for you to, as Tom presents today, we'd love if you'd put any questions you have in the Q&A pod. That helps us manage those, and it's easier for the presenter to see those and go down through the list and make sure we capture them all and address them as those questions come up in your mind as the presentation unfolds today. If you're familiar, many of you are, with TOPCORP, you know that our mission is to train regulatory and policy-making personnel. We strive to provide education that's scientific-based, that's based on science, that brings that information to you, that you can build your confidence in the areas that are presented, particularly today. And also, we know that it also provides a growth in your professional network. And that's one of the reasons we asked you, frankly, to identify yourselves and tell us a little bit about yourselves in the chat pod. It helps us connect with everybody that is on board with us today. And sometimes those of us that have been through some of the TOPCORP training recognize a name, and it spurs a reminder that there was something that we wanted to ask that person. So you might expect to see somebody's name in your email in the coming days and weeks because you have spurred that by being here. We've spent the last 6 or 7 years training the U.S., state, federal, and Canadian regulators, and internationally as well, and expanding that curriculum beyond just the onshore, which is where we started. And this is all possible because of the kind support, and it is both monetary, in kind. A lot of the folks here also provide training, so if we have a technical field trip, they participate and allow us to use some of their facilities. You'll see industry, NGOs, environmental concerns, all represented as TOPCORP supporters, and we appreciate those people who provide that support to us. We will, as I mentioned before, Dana is our technical expert and guru in the background. Please, if you have a technical problem or a question that Dana can help you with, put it in the chat pod. Dana, as I mentioned before, will be putting a survey, a poll up at the end. We just love to get feedback to know what we're doing right or wrong, and also suggestions for future webinars. And with that, I'm going to introduce to you, again, Tom Murphy, the director of Penn State Marcellus Center for Outreach and Research, on the topic today, biosecurity for on-site oil and gas infrastructure sites. And Tom, thank you for agreeing to participate in this and bring your expertise to this group. We sure appreciate it. And with that, press the record button, and this session will be recorded for future. Do you have some colleagues or yourself that want to reminded of some things that are in today's presentation? You should automatically, if technology works as it's proposed, as a registrant to today's webinar, receive an email in 3 to 5 days pointing you to a link where the recorded session will be. And with that, it's my pleasure to introduce to you Tom Murphy, Director of the Penn State Marcellus Center for Outreach and Research. Tom, thank you for being here. I will unshare my screen and hand it all over to you.
Thank you, John, and thank you for the honor to be able to present today on Cinco de Mayo. Quite the day to be able to do this. So we welcome everybody to the webinar here this afternoon, or morning, maybe for some. We're going to be talking about biosecurity. We're going to kind of set the stage with a variety of things relative to energy development. In fact, you can just look at the picture here and recognize we're going to talk about a couple of different things. We think about shale energy and shale energy development, but also with some of the others, renewables, and working at the intersection between those different types of energies as they're developed across the North American continent at this point in time. So biosecurity and thinking about that intersection of energy development or different types of energy development and preventing the spread of diseases and invasive pests is certainly going to be higher on our mind as we walk through the dialogue here today. A little bit about MCOR, just real quick. John made a couple comments, but I always like to bring everybody to the same moment here. We do both. We're the group that does the outreach and the research. Obviously, our outreach is based on the research or informed by the research that we do. Research covering a variety of things, both above ground and downhole. From geological to water to regulatory governance issue, and then certainly issues dealing with social license, which we find more and more is one of the key topics that we get into. Again, whether we're talking across North America or whether we're talking in other global situations. But that is very much a part of the dialogue and the conversation we get into. Implying that we're in those conversations implies that we're doing a lot of outreach. That is certainly the case, and one of the things that we try to do at the end of that day is we're trying to bring across or to provide a translational outreach. So taking the science or the research as we know it, explaining the gaps as we see them, and breaking all that down into pieces and delivering that to the publics that we work with so that they're more informed in the work that we're doing and more informed in the decision-making process that they're going through. Whether it's at the community level or whether it's public policy at a more public level, or quite frankly, right down to an individual level if they're talking about a lease or an impact to their property or a property that might even be contiguous to them. So all those things are important, a wide variety of different components that we like to bring into that conversation and provide a very holistic look at, in this case, shale development. But as I mentioned, we do quite a bit of work at that intersection with renewables as well. Today's topics that we're going to cover, and John touched on them just momentarily, is I'd like to set the stage with a couple quick slides about overall energy trends. Again, the theme for today is biosecurity, but biosecurity maybe in a context of where energy is going and what some of those interconnected issues are that are out there that we face when we're thinking about energy development and certainly thinking about that on the landscape. Biosecurity is kind of a top issue in a lot of different ways right now as we think of the COVID-19 and the impact that that's having on societies here in North America and certainly on a global basis. We'll reference some other types of biosecurity issues that I think are maybe a little bit more challenging over time, whereas we think the COVID might be here, for a shorter period of time. But some of these other ones have been out there for a while and they'll continue to be out there for some time into the future. So we want to be thinking about it that way. So we'll explain a little bit about biosecurity. We'll talk about where it shows up, where the problems are, why it's problematic, what do we look for in that case, and how do we reduce it? So really what we're talking about through all this is we're talking about risk and how we analyze that risk or assess that risk and deal with that, and then try to find ways to resolve that or mitigate that as best we can over time. So we'll talk about some of those issues. As we think about the energy systems that we have, we recognize that we're in a period of transition. And quite frankly, we've been in transition for a long, long time, hundreds of years of time, of course. But we're in one right now that's very dynamic in the fact that we're seeing more and more coal going offline. We see more and more renewables coming online. and certainly the expansion of shale and shale energy with oil and gas, and what that has done and the major inroads that that has made here within the North American continent, but on a global basis. Either the development of those same resources someplace else, or the market side as those resources produced here are shipped somewhere else. So that is having a very big impact from an energy transition standpoint, and we want to be thinking about that as we're thinking through the conversation we're having here again relative to biosecurity. And we'll bring those thoughts together here a little closer as we go forward. We recognize, and we're in kind of an odd moment right now, and if you were involved with our webinar a couple weeks ago that I did talking about price and domestic and global forces relative to what's driving price and where it might be going, certainly where we were and where we're heading, we recognize that we're in a very unique moment. There's no question. That's not news for anybody online right now. But beyond all that, there have been some big price advantages, we'll say, prior to the current moment. And the expectation is those price advantages will be there going into the near future and the midterm, and we'll see about the long term. That's going to be relative to the raw energy that's being produced. It's going towards power gen, or the prices coming from the that are being paid for generated power over the course of time, meaning electrical power. So certainly some advantages there. Some locations or regions are going to be more price advantaged than others. So that's going to create new opportunities. Without any question, part of what's driving all this conversation is a climate metric. And part of what's driving that is certainly there's an environmental component. There is a societal component relative to climate as we see generational differences. What millennials might be looking for relative to an older generation, and what some of the expectations relative to energy, and how that's driving and building new business models out there as companies, especially larger companies, look towards that lower carbon future, lower carbon opportunities for the products and services that they produce and offer to the marketplace. So a lot of things kind of colliding there, certainly mixing together, and certainly there's interaction between them from a market standpoint, and that's a big part of our energy paradigm and that shifting of the energy transition as we see it over time. We want to keep in mind as we're, again, thinking about the where this is all going, and I keep going back and referencing the biosecurity piece, because it might not seem so apparent in the comments that I'm making now, but it's in there. So we want to be thinking about that. We recognize that as energy and this energy paradigm is evolving and shifting, it's moving away from something and it's moving towards something. As I referenced a moment ago, less coal, more renewables, less some other things out there probably, including potentially some of the other fossil energy and time towards other types of renewables, whether it's green hydrogen or other forms of nuclear, what have you, certainly wind and solar, but there's certainly other technologies that are emerging in time and things that we probably haven't even thought of that could be a mainstay in our power as we advance well into the future. But we recognize that there's lots of different issues and concerns that communities have. Today we're going to talk about biosecurity, but we get into conversations and the work that we do and work that you do, dealing with transmission lines, pipeline right away, just we'll say the broader infrastructure. We recognize that as more and more of this infrastructure is being built and some of those societal demands are being placed on companies or impacting companies' decisions and communities' decisions, there is certainly a demand out there for more distributed power. So instead of those centralized baseload power plants, more distributed power and more distributed energy development, and then power generation from that same development in a lot of different places where it hadn't possibly been in the past. So certainly we know that energy development or power generation is very widespread, but we're seeing a much more planned approach. Some cases, maybe not so much, but typically a more planned approach to have more distributed power generation and having that, having it generated in a lot of different places around North America, and again in locations where it might not have been in the past. So that then generates for us a concern or an interest in more of that discussion about biosecurity issues as we think about some of the implications that we'll explore here in just a moment. And then the other issues there are certainly environmental issues and that economic component that comes from that as we think about this over the course of time. Mention here quickly as we finish out these couple of thoughts about, we think about some of the issues, some of the above ground issues in particular when we talk about shale energy development, and we see these as being somewhat uniform wherever we're working in the world. Again, whether we're domestic or whether we're international, there's a certain number of issues that just continue to pop up that with a good energy planning, you really need to be thinking about a whole host of different issues and the interplay between those issues to make sure that there's a good outcome over the course of time. So I listed a few here, and we think about environmental benchmarking or baseline environmental assessments as we typically like to talk about them. We've done a lot of that type of work, again, domestically and internationally, as companies are thinking about and countries are thinking about moving forward with all different types of energy development, in particular with shale energy. And then just a wide variety of different issues there, from waste to water, air issues and air emission issues, different types of technology, coordination between different types of agencies, different permits and how they go through a certain process, regulatory process, and going from different agencies from one to the other, and the considerations that go into those. Infrastructure needs, and again, you can see the list there in the different comments. As I think about biosecurity and start to introduce that a little bit more here, many of these issues that I have listed on this slide, we see them at face value for what they are, but the reality is behind that, any and all those could be impacting or influence biosecurity issues and the implications that could come from that, and certainly the outcomes thereof. A couple of weeks ago, John had showed a map similar to this. We're bringing a updated version here to you. And there's lots of different things that I like to point out from a graphic like this. We can talk about workforce, we can talk about regulations and roads and just a wide variety of things. But as we think about biosecurity, a couple of points that I want to make in particular. One, obviously, lots of different wells. These are all shale wells. And if you went back to the early 2000s, or we'll say maybe to the year 2000, essentially you wouldn't have seen anything there. So each one of those represents a pad, it represents land disturbance, it represents pipeline development or roads. There's lots of different things that go into that story. Again, as we think about invasive weeds or pests, as we talk about some of them as we go forward here. So it's not to say that it's problematic. What it is to say we need good planning and make sure, just like any type of development, whether it's a subdivision going in or a highway or a power line, transmission line going in, it really doesn't matter whether it's shale development or any of those others. What it does matter is to make sure that we have good planning. So we want to be thinking about that as we step through this process. The other thing that I want to use as an illustration here, and again, apologies to those that are in other parts of North America beyond the Appalachian basin here, but just using this as an example since it's where we're based. You see this northeastern part of, this is Pennsylvania, and the development that's here, and there are a number of companies that are operating in this area where I'm using the pointer, and this area down here. So as we think about companies that might move from that southwestern corner to the northeastern corner with people and equipment, moving some of their products back and forth and just shuffling things around. We want to think about some of those invasive type species and some of the biosecurity risks that might be attached to that. So there's a special precaution that we want to embed in this conversation as we think about this type of development going forward. So what is biosecurity? And you always, when you get into something like this, you just want to describe it or just want to define it. So we think about, right now, and you can read through it as well, but the definition, procedures intended to protect humans and animals against disease or harmful biological agents. So biosecurity could be something that's deployed in a meatpacking plant, for instance, when you bring live animals in and you have the potential for E. coli. Or we think about people as they're moving in that same plant, or trucks that are coming in one end with animals and going out with meat products. How do you separate them to make sure that you have a good, secure facility and you prevent any type of interaction between what could be harmful and what could be regulated to be safe? So biosecurity can show up in a lot of different things, just using that as one example. And the one on the right-hand side, we think about that goes a little further and talks about, and we're going to get into this one in particular, but we think about this transmission of infectious diseases that go beyond just a human piece. And right now with certainly the COVID-19, it's top of mind for everybody. But beyond that, we think about some of the work that we're doing in the field. We want to be thinking about this transmission of diseases or other types of issues, pests in the field between crops and livestock and some of the other places that we work. I'm not going to get into the COVID-19. I can't imagine there's anybody alive, certainly in North America, that doesn't read about it 3 or 4 times a day at this point with all the social media and all the news stories that come out. But the reality is it's real big. No surprise to anybody there. And causing, you think about the North American situation, you're looking between several countries here, you're looking at trillions of dollars of impact. And that could just be the start of it, before we see what this is going to look like, how long it's going to go, and what the implications are going to be over the course of time. So there's financial impact, there's health-related impact, no question, number of people that are sickened by it or have died from it, and also social implications, lots of different things. But there's a variety of others, and that's what I want to list here, and again, where the point of emphasis is going to be. Some of the ones that are emerging, like the African swine flu that is in other countries around the world, in Africa and China and some of the other Asian countries, something that we're looking very closely at preventing from coming into the US in particular, Pennsylvania specifically, where I'm based. We've had AI or avian influenza that has come and gone numerous times. That can be a $1 billion or more impact with farmers when they lose their poultry herds. And then the decommissioning of barns and the cleaning of barns and just the variety of things that happen as an outcome of that. Then I listed some other ones there. We think about foot and mouth disease or some of the other livestock and horse-related diseases that are out there that might prevent livestock from going to market or prevent horses from moving around. Again, thinking about some of the different audience that's on the webinar here today and some of the work that you do and some of what you interact with. So it's important for us to be thinking about preventing these type of outbreaks by having good biosecurity with the contracting work that's being done when we're talking about doing things on the landscape or visits that are being made by regulators or salespeople or whoever that might be going out to some of these farms or some of these landscape locations as, again, we're doing some of the work that we're doing in an energy standpoint. And if you think on this barn picture down here on the bottom lower right, you think if this area, back up, this area here, if this is a pipeline going right past the barn and you've got contractors who are coming in and they're moving from farm to farm, we want to be thinking about preventing the spread of something from one farm to the other when we're talking about confinement operations like that. We've learned lots of different things about these different issues. There are certainly new ones as we're learning about COVID-19 right now, how to prevent it, how to deal with it while it's here. But certainly there's very widespread knowledge, as I indicated before, on the COVID-19. But there's a lot of these others that people are not so familiar with. And again, as we think about the energy world that we work in, and many of these different landscape situations that we work in, whether it's in an area where there's a lot of animal agriculture or cultivated agriculture, or whether we're talking out on a wide open rangeland, or whether we're talking up in the mountains that are wooded or not, but areas that, might not necessarily be next to some of that farmland, but something that's more distant. There still is issues there that we need to think about. And the reality is that we have people, contractors, visitors, a variety of others that are going out there. We want to be thinking about this prevention of these problems. Prevention because we don't want to have to deal with the treatment. Meaning if we could have prevented the COVID-19 versus dealing with the issues we're doing right now, certainly there's no question we would have wanted to do that. So the same thing would hold when we think about some of these other biosecurity concerns. If we can identify them and stop them before they spread, that's certainly where we want to be. So that's the most important thing. And one of the key considerations there is understanding the pathways of where they come from and how they spread, and making sure that we're dealing with some of the protocols to prevent that. And then lastly, as we think about those protocols, we want to be thinking about those sanitation management techniques, and showing a couple different pictures here as we think about how we might enter a farm, or we might be dealing with going into one of those type of situations where there could be a biosecurity concern, or out to a drill site or other type of energy development. That might be a pipeline right away, or a variety of different things. As we're going from one location to the other, we want to make sure that we're not spreading something and we're containing that spread if it's out there on the landscape already. Right down to personal type of things we think about, even making sure as we move from one location to the other, down to the picture of somebody scrubbing their boots, depending upon what the biosecurity risk is and whether that protocol, that safety protocol and sanitation protocol makes sense. We've seen a number of, and I'm going to use again the example that's going to be largely to the east, but spans a variety of places as well, or is expanding unfortunately into a variety of places. We think about some of these other biosecurity risks. They're not just the animal agriculture piece, which is a big one because of the cost factor and the animal health issues that are associated with that. But we have a number of invasive plant species that are out there that have become very problematic, sometimes in a very short amount of time, and others it has taken a much longer period of time. So we see invasive plants and invasive insects, animals, organisms that have unfortunately showed up and have spread across the North American continent, coming in from different places, sometimes through ships or products or water or things that are moved around. But these are the type of things that once they're in a region, or once they're in some sort of location, these are things that we want to make sure that we're thinking about, understanding what the risk is, and trying to prevent or stop the pathway of them from moving from one location to another. So the fuel on the top, we think about Japanese knotweed, a big one, grows along water courses, things of that nature. Japanese stiltgrass, one that's become very common in wooded locations. So think pipelines and well pads and roads and things of that nature. Hay-scented ferns, which have been out there for a long, long time, but we see move into deep forested areas when there's some sort of a cut in that area, and you have forest fragmentation, and it allows more of that to go in. And it doesn't necessarily mean that it came from energy development. Could be from somebody building a driveway. Could be from a logging operation. There's a variety of ways that these things happen. Cheatgrass, well known as a problem across the western states. You think about algae or different types of algae that are moved from one place to another, and other types of aquatic weeds as well that get moved sometimes by boat, sometimes by water being ferried from place to place, or things of that nature. Then you get down into the list at the bottom. Spotted lanternfly, and the chart on the picture, the upper right-hand corner, is a spotted lanternfly. Bottom chart shows the quarantine areas that are now in Pennsylvania, but this is something that has spread to several different states, surrounding states, and is very problematic and could be a multi-billion-dollar hit to a variety of different industries throughout that area and throughout the state and throughout the region, multi-state region. But beyond that, zebra mussels, the ash borer that's been here for a number of years now, that's essentially decimated the ash lumber industry. And then I was on another webinar this morning talking about ticks and how ticks are moving around, and the Lyme disease issue that's associated with them in a number of places in the whole eastern part of the U.S., and up into the lower tier of eastern Canada, but Lyme disease being problematic and being associated with invasive pests. So several different types of plants, several which are listed up above, that those ticks are associated with, and again, one invasive pest causing an issue with another. So the point in all this is we want to be thinking about how that we can prevent these. It starts with identifying and understanding the range of the problem, the issues here, and certainly the intensity and what this could be, and how can we prevent these things. Some of the ones that are listed here are moved in soil. Some of these are moved by seed. Some of these are moved by air currents. Some of these are moved by water. And some of these crawl or swim to another location, or fly when you think about the lantern flies. So lots of different pathways to understand and to reflect on as we're thinking about that. This shot is one that we've used in other times, not in this series of webinars, but I think it's instructive for us as we think about what it was that we had in the past and some of these very, very early shale pads as they were developed. This was in southwestern Pennsylvania in the Marcellus, and what those same pads, or what pads will say, look like now. So you can look at that and see, lots of changes that have occurred, but again, the context that I want to put it in is with biosecurity and the idea of trying to contain things and stop the spread, or at least slow spread, of biosecurity risks or some of those invasives, whether they're diseases or insects or plants, in this case, particularly plants, as we think about equipment moving from place to place. So certainly the pad on the top is cleaner. Trucks coming in and out are going to come off of a road where you're not going to likely have any mud. You're going across the road coming in, an access road that's clean and being kept clean, and onto a pad that's going to be relatively clean as well. So you don't have the nearly as much of a risk factor for moving some of those invasive plants either by seed or by pieces from site to site. Now, the original construction of that site with some of the construction equipment, that would be the case, but once up in operation, much less of that. And then when it goes back into a condensed site, then again, those risks will heighten again, and some of that consideration will have to change. Compared to the site below, where more mud either washing away or being carried away in truck tires. So if you start to look for places where there could be risk, these are some of the things that we're looking for, and we're trying to prevent as we illustrate and work with individuals and companies, and certainly within communities and in other countries around the world that are trying to get this right and trying to stop the spread of some of these invasives and prevent some of the biosecurity risks as they might be there. Where are some of the other ones? This is a solar site. Give you some kind of an idea, and I recognize there's lots of different solar sites in many different places across North America. This is one where there's obviously a little more rainfall, so you have a more robust cover here with grass. What that also allows is some of the invasives to come in and harbor themselves. As you see this short video in the slides, it tips under some of the different panels there. It's very easy for the owner of the site to be able to mow between them, but trying to get under them and trying to control some of the invasives that come in there, some of the noxious weeds that might be in there, and particularly some that might have seeds that are very apt to be blown by the wind once they're mature from site to site. A place like this can really harbor that and be problematic. So thinking about once these sites are being designed and being placed on the landscape, how can we think about some of those biosecurity risks, even though they're not present at that moment? What might they look like over time, and how can we plan ahead and control for that and mitigate any of that type of risk before it shows up and is indeed problematic? This goes a little further and maybe a little closer to the topic as we think about shale energy, shot by drone from a couple hundred feet. Again, it's not so much of a surprise for many or most of you that have been to shale sites. You can see the pad here, and certainly the long access road that comes in. Part of this road used to be a logging road. This is on actually a piece of state land, and you can see from the background there a big block of thousands of acres or hectares of deep forested ground with very few cuts through it. And then in this case, where you have a lot of edge that has been created either with the pad or the roads or the pipeline transmission lines that will go back out of here, or that do indeed go out of here. So with that edge or with those openings, what that creates is a potential for the risk of biosecurity issues, in particular with, in this case, with invasive pests when we think about weeds specifically, because they would be the ones most prone to be there. The stiltgrass that we mentioned, or in this case, this is in actually not too far from where I live, or some of those other types of grasses or weeds, including Japanese knotweed that could show up in a place like this, or the hay-scented ferns and then spread back into the trees, and at that point, as far as they can spread back, then preventing new seedlings from coming up to recover and to rebuild the forest as trees are cut over time. We also can think beyond that. So again, not just some of those eastern examples, but as we think about some of the drier land examples, and we go west in this case, and some of the pictures lent to me by some of my friends at BLM, including some that may be on the webinar today. But as we think about a time lapse with some of this drilling over the course of time, and this is not obviously one of the big unconventional sites, but this is one that more conventional, a smaller conventional type of a operation, but looking at it again over the course of time and recognizing that oil and gas development is intended to be something that's temporary and not something that's permanent. So we want to be thinking about this going back into its native type of state. And in a dry land situation, that's going to be much more difficult because of just the lack of water. And you have invasive species that would come in on truck tires or equipment or things of that nature. It would be, and they start to spread out and they're more competitive with some of the natives. It would be almost impossible to be able to remediate this back to site without a lot of chemical controls and certainly a lot of time and money spent to do that. So limiting those impacts, reducing that exposure to invasives is going to be key over the course of time. Using a similar, so we think about not just the actual development, but road access or pipelines going through, making sure that if you've got lots of area that potentially you could drive, that you don't do that. You stay to the right-of-ways. So design, plan out the right-of-ways, stick to them and stay off the other areas for a variety of reasons, but certainly in this case, we think about invasives, that we keep whatever issues are there to those confined areas. And then if there are invasives that show up, then you have a much tighter area to have to control them again over the course of time. So what about reducing the risk? So we've identified, we talk about why this is more apt to be, a risk over time with the idea about distributed energy development and certainly power generation. So we're going to see more energy development over the course and more transmission, whether it's moving electrons or moving molecules. We're going to see more of that transmission over new acreage over the course of time. So we want to be thinking about is this energy development or some part of this energy story transitions over wider spaces in places where it hasn't been. We want to make sure that we're understanding what these invasive issues could be, what these biosecurity issues could be, and that we make sure that we're reducing that risk. Number one that I want to put out here, again, we think when there's livestock operations, is don't enter ag buildings unannounced, meaning don't walk into a place where there might be a biosecurity issue that's there, meaning don't walk in a barn where there might be animals that you might walk through manure, then get in your truck, then go to another barn and spread that same risk or spread it out into the landscape if you're going from the barn out to the job site. So don't enter a barn. Not all barns are marked with a sign about biosecurity. So again, this is something that we're trying to educate people. And if you have people that work for you, you want to be thinking about educating them as well if they're not on the webinar today. Biosecurity is a very big issue. Again, as we think about the COVID-19 and we recognize from a human standpoint, we want to be thinking about it from a landscape and from an animal health standpoint as well. Understanding what those biosecurity risks are, understanding that pathway to spread, and we talked a little bit about that. Again, in the slide that I showed with the different types of invasive species, recognizing that there's lots of different ways that they can move: air spread, water, on truck tires, a variety of different things. So some of those are common sense. Other ones, people just don't think about them quite so much. I've been in these locations before. There was never a problem, or it wasn't so apparent. Yeah, I see that there's some stilt grass growing over there against the edge of the woods and spreading, but I really thought about where that might come from. Well, these are the type of things that we're trying to prevent and slow that spread or eliminate that spread in new locations. So understand where those species come from, and understand how these can move around. And again, as I showed that graphic in the beginning with that map, if you have operations in multiple places within a state or within contiguous states or beyond that, recognize that you can be moving some of these invasives from one location to another, even with some of those being at great distances. So it's not just you're working on a pipeline and you're going between different farms. Maybe there's 10 farms in a row and you're going from one to the next, and that's a very important consideration. But also think if you're going from one site to the next, might have 100 miles of road distance between, you still could be moving something on that bulldozer that you're hauling on the trailer or behind the truck. So think about those things and educate your workforce about that. Cleaning PPE, boots would be certainly a high risk there, but it could be something else. Your FRs, you might have walked through something and now you've got some weed seeds on that can move from one site to another. So just a quick check and make sure that that's not problematic. Another one would be, as we think about moving things where there are, again, back to the east, we think about our spotted lanternfly. The female likes to lay the eggs or the egg mass on things that sit for a short period of time. So it's not just on the side of trees or side of buildings, but it could be on the side of a truck or under a car or on a piece of pipe or a piece of equipment. There's a desire by that creature to attach those egg masses to things that are rusty. And in the energy business, the oil and gas industry, there are a few things out there that have some rust on them that would be attractive. So again, think about some of these things as we move them around. And then lastly, making biosecurity a part of daily safety briefings. So I suspect that most everybody on this webinar today is involved in a safety briefing. Whether it's, maybe it's not on a daily basis, most of them are, even if it's on one that's longer than that. But if you're operating out in the field, you want to be thinking about biosecurity and biosecurity risk and reducing that same risk or eliminating that risk in the work that you do or in the part that you play as we think about the business of energy development. Something else to consider is cleaning equipment. So I mentioned about those, the bulldozers and moving from site to site at distances, but we want to be thinking about cleaning some of that equipment before it moves from different sites. If we're doing a pipeline, for instance, and for some reason move off of the right-of-way, either by trail or by other means, and certainly we want to be working inside those right-of-ways, but cleaning that equipment so we're not carrying something in the tracks of that equipment or on some other aspect of that operation. I've mentioned numerous times about animal agriculture, and again, we think a number of different places where energy development is being done. There's animal agriculture involved. So whether we're out in some large rangeland that's being grazed, or we're in a more tightly cultivated area where you have lots of dairy or other types of livestock, especially confined animal operations, particularly cautious in those areas that we're not moving something from one to the other. Manures and other types of materials coming out of those operations are certainly the ones that we're pointing to and looking at most. But all those different considerations are going to be very important. People are on the call and are on this webinar and you're thinking, that's just not practical. It's not practical, maybe, to the moment that you're thinking of it, but you have to think about the operation that you're impacting, meaning the farm operation that you might be going through. When you think about the several $1 billion in each one of the avian influenza outbreaks there were and the impact of those individual operations, we want to be thinking about making sure that we're caring for those landowners as we're working through the properties that they allowed us to go through. So think about ways and protocols that you can make it practical, and there are a number of those as we think about them in the work that we're doing, building pipelines in particular, or other types of transmission lines if it might be a power line. Trying to reduce forest fragmentation would be a big consideration here as well. And I mentioned a number of pests that like edge or new edge as it's cut through some big blocks of open area. Forest fragmentation or large areas of rangeland would be pretty much the same. So any place that you can have dual use or we'll say transmission corridors where you're bringing pipe and wire through the same area would be beneficial. So limiting that new edge. The other point that I want to make there is very often in the picture here is an illustration of that through this particular piece of farmland. When this was finished, company came in, obviously renovated this back to what it needed to be, came in, seeded it, and then mulched it, making sure that the clean materials are being used for mulch and certified seed is being used to prevent weeds from coming in. One of the biggest complaints that I've been exposed to with many of the different farmers that I've worked with at that interface between agriculture and energy, both with transmission lines, meaning overhead, and below ground, we think about pipelines, is that issue about mulching and about using clean seed. So that's an important one, not just getting the cheapest round bales that somebody had out in the fence row and would sell cheap, but using clean materials going across areas, particularly areas like this are going to be very impactful to the farmers over the course of time. And then maintaining those right-of-ways. So whether it's, again, out across a piece of rangeland, or whether it's up through a big block of forest, or whether it's across an agricultural operation like this, making sure that if invasives do show up, that there is a maintenance schedule to be able to deal with them, either one that the landowner is involved in or whether the company follows through and make sure that they do that. And lastly, as we think about that, just a real quick note about landowner etiquette. And again, I recognize that most people on the call, that's probably not a problem. But again, if you're working with different people or you have new people in your operation or some of your workforce, some of your laborers are out there or people that work for you are going out in the field that may be new to some of these different agricultural areas in particular, we want to make sure that they're calling ahead, that they're scheduling those visits with the landowner, in particular if it's a farm owner. If there are gates, that they're locking those gates in and out, that there's not some sort of a mix-up that they thought, well, you know, they'll lock it on the way out at the end of the day. They don't see any animals out there, so it doesn't seem like it's an issue. So you want to make sure that you're locking them in and out and just make the presumption that if the gate is there, it's closed and it's locked, that it should be locked after you go through it and should be locked after you're done and secured. You want to definitely make sure you stay within defined corridors. So if there's a road that's been agreed to or right-of-way that's been agreed to, make sure you stay within that. Don't go out across open areas just because they're open and you could drive through them, but stay within those corridors as they're defined. Some of those open areas might have been recently planted. They might have been recently sprayed. You could track something out of there into another area. They might have had manure applied to them. There could have been a variety of different reasons. But the reality is you want to stay out of those areas that are not within the defined right-of-way and within that corridor. Don't leave materials out. So it could be a variety of different things. It could be fuel that's unlocked in the tank. It could be building materials that are easily portable. I mean, big stacks of pipe are not going to disappear overnight, but something that's smaller. You want to make sure the kids don't get in it and that you're not leaving it out and the landowner doesn't have to be concerned with somebody within the region going out and causing a problem on that particular land holding. Lock your equipment, eliminate attractive hazards. So things that people can climb in or walk through or get involved in. An attractive hazard could be, or attractive nuisance, the same, could be something like a large pond. So we think about pond impoundments that are made for water being used for fracs. A good reason why fences are put around to make sure that there's a gate and they're locked and the people can't get in there. And understanding your setting. Again, if you go out into a large field, you go through a gate, you don't see any animals, you think of the picture on the bottom corner there, go out across that field or just, you know, peer up in there, you can't see what's over the ridge, just assume that there's some animals in there. So if you're sending somebody out that's fearful of animals or doesn't know what to do if, you know, a herd of cows showed up as they crested that hill, make sure that there's some understanding of that and they understand what it is that you're going into and what the possibilities might be. So you wrap all this up and, you know, the reality is there's some common sense in this particular slide. I actually wanted to say don't do stupid things, but I thought maybe that wasn't, the etiquette of that wasn't so kind. So we'll just go with practice good common sense. And lastly, just real quick, you know, we think about pipelines, you know, we talk a lot about transmission here. We want to think about the fact that there's a couple key places when we're thinking about pipelines, we're thinking about that, trying to renovate them back. And one of the reasons we think about that, again, is for biosecurity. The quicker that we can take them back and reestablish them back into a seeded situation with cover, a strong cover, is that will keep out invasives. So one of the things that can be done, it's certainly important to get the topsoil back, get the different layers back. And if you listen to Justin last week, he went through that, or last week he went through that in some great depth. The seeding, some of the considerations there, we want to make sure that the right seed is applied and that the mulch is put down to nurture that seed bed over the course of time. And also working with the landowners or the farmers and the contractors that are putting those transmission lines in. And again, it could be pipeline or overhead lines. But trying to do the best job possible, lay that out in the work plan, make sure that the farm owner is aware of what that plan is, and don't deviate from that unless there's a sign off from that landowner before that deviation would occur. Just a quick example of a successful pipeline going in. The cutout picture you can see there, you know, what it looked like going through. Certainly topsoil being conveyed to one side, and then good measures being put in to keep any erosion from leaving the site, keeping the water crossings protected and renovated, remediated, I should say, over the course of time, and then maintained over the long term. So I think it's an example of for the most part, a site that was done pretty well. So with that, I'm going to stop and I'm going to turn it back to John. And if there's any questions, I'd be glad to jump back there.
Tom, thank you very much. We appreciate that. And there are a few questions. And as I was watching the presentation, you made a couple points that struck home with me, and some of them, a couple of them, because I've fallen prey to them, particularly the one about closing gates. I know that I'm just going to walk into this pasture or field for 3 minutes, and there's no reason to latch the gate. And then, you know, as it always turns out, I'm there for half an hour, and the wind caught the gate and blew it open, and something wandered out that shouldn't have wandered out. And I'm that guilty person. And so you talked about common sense, but maybe depending on where you're at, there's kind of a different thinking when it comes to walking around your vehicle looking for an insect, or walking around the equipment on the trailer before it leaves the well pad to look for an egg mass or something like that. That may be a different kind of thinking depending on where in the country you are and what kind of invasive species that might be there. So, and with that, Tom, somebody did ask, is there a site is there an internet site, a website to go to for two things? One, to be able to identify weeds and insects, and two, is there an internet website that you could go to that highlights areas that have invasive species that are on some sort of a watch, or that you have to be concerned about keeping track of going in and out of a quote unquote quarantined area because of some invasive species?
Yeah, John, it's a good question. And I'd have to, maybe as a point of humor, I'll start with your comment about the gate, and I'll go to the second part. But I have a family member who has a well pad on the property, and one of the contractors that was doing some of the initial work went into his pasture, which is up in a large wooded area, thousands of acres of woods around, and a piece of pasture essentially in the midst of that. left the gate open, the landowner, family member went back, feed the cows, these are beef cows, discovered there was no cows, and the reality was the cows were lost. It took several months, I believe, for those cows to finally find their way back. And in the meantime, the company actually paid for the cows. So, you know, those things do happen. It doesn't, it sounds maybe a little humorous when you're just hearing one of the stories, but when you're your animals, it's very problematic. To your question about where do you go to look for the invasives, I would say that the best place, we have a site, we have a Penn State site, which would apply to some, but certainly not everybody on the webinar. We have a site that lists invasives. So if you go to our Penn State Extension website and then type in invasive species, you would find a website or a web page that would list a number of those species that would be problematic, that would be descriptive, would tell you what to look for, would tell you what some of the control methods are. Being more universal than that, I would say that each Department of Agriculture in each province or state that might be on the call here today would be able to, you would be able to go to their website, do the same thing. And I know we've done that with a number of them, so I'm pretty sure it's pretty universal, and would tell you what would be problematic in that particular jurisdiction that you would be able to go and look and be able to learn to identify and then to be able to reduce that same risk. So hopefully that gives the answer pretty broadly to your question, John.
Thank you. Hey, Tom, and as I read this next question, and I think I recognize and know that this question comes from Bruno, and I believe he's in South Florida. And I wonder if this is a term that would be familiar to those in that area and maybe not here. And maybe you are, Tom, but his question is with gates, if dummy locked, and there's a term I'm not familiar with, if dummy locked when you get there, do you recommend leaving it dummy locked or do you click it shut? And I don't know, Bruno, if you might elaborate on that, or Tom, you might know what that term.
Well, I'm gonna make the assumption, John, that unless Bruno goes a little further, but I'm gonna make the assumption that what's being said is it has a keyed lock or a combination lock on it, and it's just turned so it looks like it's locked, but it's not actually clicked. And I would be reluctant. I would, when I went in and came back out, I would put it in the same state that it was. I might be inclined to find the landowner either through a call, if that made sense, or through some other means to identify the fact that that's how I found it and that's how I left it. One of the concerns that I would have would be that there could be somebody out in that site that you can't see, and you might be locking them in. You know, that could be a possibility. So I would just be reluctant to set it differently than that. But that said, I would not leave it open by any means. There was a gate, it was, you know, it had some level of being locked, and I would try to get it back into some level before I left.
This is as much an educational comment perhaps as anything else, and I kind of chuckled as I read it. This is from Brett, and I think if I remember seeing, Brett is with Colorado Oil and Gas Conservation Commission in Colorado, obviously, and he makes the comment, and those of you that have worked around fences, and particularly electric fences, will certainly relate to this. The comment was, electric fence gates can be extremely hard to see. Be observant for any signs of electric fence. You don't want to try and repair a live electric fence and you get zapped a few times and learn that. So thanks for that, Brett. That's a good comment. And we run into electric fences quite often. I don't know if there's anything to add to that, Tom. Electric fences, particularly if you're moving fast through an area and there aren't that many fence posts, you can quickly find an electric fence post or electric wire that you didn't know was there, and find a little excitement rather quickly, I guess.
Yeah, John, I would agree. I think that goes maybe to the comment about staying on the right of way. You know, you breach the right of way, and you could have more of a chance of that problem. You stay on the right of way, and if you can see you're about to drive through a fence line, you can make the assumption that either there's some sort of gate or wire there, or at least there's a high probability one. You should have a heightened review to see if it's there.
Yeah. And as we close out, Dana has put the poll up. We really would appreciate, again, I'll reiterate that if you would, if you'd respond to the questions on the little survey, just a moment of time will help us there. And again, if you have any suggestions for future webinars, we'd love to hear those, something that would be valuable to you folks. Tom, I don't think there are any other questions. And with that, I'll just say thank you very much. We really appreciate your expertise and time, and appreciate your willingness to spend that with us all here today. And to our participants, thank you for being here. And if you are interested, this Thursday, May 7th, Brian Swisstock will talk about water tests and the interpretation of them. So if you have an interest in water tests around the energy field, join us on Thursday. You should have gotten an email by now to register. You can still register up until the moment of the webinar to participate. It is 1:30 Eastern Time. This coming Thursday, May 7th, you can join us then. So until then, Tom, thanks again. Thank you to our participants for joining us today. We hope you all have a great day and be safe. Thanks again, and we'll see you soon again. Thank you.
Thanks, John. Thanks, Dana.